The stage road through Garnet Pass was not a forgiving place in November, and everyone who lived within 10 miles of it knew that. The rocks came down off the ridge in the dark without warning. The cold settled in before you were ready for it, and the light went fast in the afternoons, pulling the color out of the pines and the pale grass before you had finished looking at them. There was a relay station at the top of the pass, a low stone building with a sod roof and a chimney that smoked when the wind permitted, and for 11 years it had been operated by a man named Clara Crale, who had died in September of a chest ailment that had been working on him since the previous winter. His wife, Clara Crale, had buried him on the south-facing slope where the ground was still workable, and she had kept the lamp burning in the station window every night since, because that was what the station was for, and she did not know how to do the thing halfway. She was 34 years old. She had come to the pass at 23 as a new wife, had learned the work alongside Aldous, had kept the ledgers and the supply records and the horse rotation log in a hand that was steadier than his, and had delivered 2 children in that stone building, one of whom had lived. Her daughter, Wren, was 8 years old and had her father's serious eyes and her mother's habit of watching a situation all the way through before she committed to a position on it. They were, the 2 of them, as self-contained as the station itself, and they had managed the 6 weeks since Aldous' death without asking anything of anyone. The difficulty arrived on a Tuesday in early November in the form of a man named Harlan Pruett. Pruett was the regional contract agent for the stage line, a man with a voice built for delivering news he expected to be argued with. He came up the pass in a company buggy, tied his horse at the post, and stood in the station doorway with his hat in his hands and his expression already arranged into something between sympathy and administration. He told Clara that the line appreciated her continued service in the difficult period following her husband's passing. He told her that the line had a responsibility to its passengers and its drivers. He told her that a relay station required a man capable of handling teams in distress, of managing the road in the event of rockfall or washout, of representing the company's interests in situations that could turn physical. Clara stood at the counter with her hands flat on the wood and listened to all of it. Wren sat at the table behind her, doing her letters, not looking up. Pruett told Clara that the company would be sending a new operator in the spring, a Mr. Denton Farr, who had experience on the Bitter Creek line and came well recommended. He told her that she and her daughter would of course be given adequate time to make arrangements. He told her that the company was grateful. Clara said, "What is adequate time?" Pruett said the company was thinking the end of March. Clara's face did what she needed it to do. She thanked him for coming up personally to tell her. She offered him coffee, which he declined. She walked him to his buggy and stood in the road while he turned around and started back down the grade, and she watched until the buggy was out of sight around the first switchback. Then she went back inside, stood at the counter for a moment, and started supper. Wren said, without looking up from her letters, "Are we leaving?" Clara said, "Not today." By the second autumn, people in the valley would refer to that winter as the one Clara Crale kept the pass open. She didn't know that yet. She was thinking about flour and lamp oil and whether the near horse was developing a soft spot in his left front shoe. And she was not going to fall apart over Harlan Pruett, because she had decided that in advance. The lamp burned in the window that night, as it did every night, steady and without drama, visible from the valley floor on clear evenings as a fixed point of orange light at the top of the dark ridge, the way a star holds its position while everything else moves around it. It was that lamp that saved the man's life, which is where this story properly begins. His name was Cobb Aldrin. He was 38 years old, a man who built things, specifically roads and the structures that roads required, bridges and retaining walls and drainage works, and the occasional building when a county needed one, and had the sense to hire someone who understood how weight moved through stone. He had been contracted by the territorial government to survey the northern approach to Garnet Pass for a possible road improvement, a project that had been discussed for 6 years and funded partially for one. He had ridden up from the valley on a November afternoon that had looked manageable when he started and had turned, by the time he reached the upper switchbacks, into something else entirely. The storm came off the ridge without much announcement, the way storms did up there. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in the time it took him to cover a quarter mile, and the wind came with it, and then the snow, not heavy but driving, horizontal, the kind that gets into everything and takes the landmarks away, one at a time until you are not certain of anything. He had lost the road somewhere above the second switchback. His horse, a steady animal named Pratt, who had carried him through worse, had slowed and was picking his way with the careful deliberateness of a horse that knows it does not know where it is going. Cobb had dismounted and was leading him, feeling for the edge of the road with his boot, which was not a reliable method. The light appeared above him and to the left. It was not a large light. It was a single window's worth of lamp, orange and unwavering, set into the dark of the ridge like something left there on purpose, which it had been. He did not know that yet. He only knew it was fixed, and he was not, and he turned toward it and climbed. Clara heard the horse before she heard the knock. She was used to reading sounds on the pass, and a horse moving slow and uncertain up the approach path in the middle of a storm was a specific sound, different from the stage teams, different from the company riders. She had the door open before Cobb finished raising his hand to knock on it. He was snow-covered from the hat down, and his face had the careful stillness of a man managing cold. He was leading a bay horse by the reins, and the horse looked tired and relieved in the way horses do when they understand they have arrived somewhere. Clara stepped back from the door. "Bring him around to the barn," she said. "I'll have the lamp." She took the barn lantern from its hook by the door, lit it from the kitchen lamp, and went out ahead of him into the snow. She showed him the stall, showed him where the feed was, showed him the water trough and the pump handle. She left him to it and went back inside and put the coffee on and cut bread and set out the cold beans from supper, because a man who had been in that wind for however long he had been in it would need something immediate. He came in 20 minutes later, his hat in his hand, snow still melting in the creases of his coat. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of hands that had been working with stone and timber long enough that they looked like part of the work. His face was weathered and plain and not unkind. He said, "I'm obliged to you. I've lost worse situations than that one, but I was getting there." Clara said, "Sit down. The coffee's ready." He sat. He ate what she put in front of him without comment, except to say once that the beans were good, which they were not especially, but she understood he meant something else by it. Wren appeared in the doorway of the back room in her nightgown, assessed the situation with her father's eyes, and said, "You were on the road in that." Cobb looked at her. "I was." "That was not wise," Wren said. The corner of Cobb's mouth moved at once and returned to where it had been. Clara said, "Wren." Wren said, "It wasn't," and went back to bed. The storm ran through the night and into the morning. Cobb slept on the bench by the stove, which Clara had indicated, with a folded blanket and no particular ceremony, and Clara slept in the back room with Wren, and woke at 5 as she always did to tend the stove and start the lamp cycle and check the road. The road was buried under 8 inches of new snow, and a section of the upper retaining wall had come down, scattering rock across the grade. She was standing at the edge of it, assessing, when Cobb came up behind her with his coat buttoned and his hat pulled down. He looked at the wall. He looked at the road. He said, "That'll need to come up before a team can get through." Clara said, "I know it." He said, "I can help with that." She looked at him. He was not offering to take it over. He was offering to help. There was a difference, and she had enough experience with men to know it. She said, "All right." They worked the rock fall for 3 hours, moving stone to the downhill side, clearing the grade by hand and with the iron bar from the station's tool shed. Cobb knew how to move rock, which was not a common skill, and he knew how to look at a pile of it and understand which piece to take first, so the rest followed without incident. Clara watched him do this once, and then she understood the method, and they worked without needing to discuss it further. By mid-morning the grade was passable, and the first stage of the day came through without incident, the driver lifting his hand to Clara from the box in the way drivers did when they were grateful and in a hurry. Cobb's survey work was supposed to take him 3 days on the pass. The storm had cost him one, and the road clearing had cost him a morning, and his horse had thrown the loose shoe that Clara had suspected was coming, which cost him the afternoon because the nearest farrier was in the valley, and there was no point riding down on a 3-shoed horse in the current conditions. He did not make himself a burden during any of this. He split wood without being asked. He checked the horses in the evening. He ate what was put in front of him and said it was good and meant something by it each time. He spoke when spoken to and was quiet when not, which was most of the time, and the quiet was the comfortable kind, not the loaded kind. Wren warmed to him on the second day, cautiously, the way she did everything. She showed him her letters book. He looked at it with genuine attention and said her hand was steady, which it was, and which no one had told her before because Aldous had been sick and Clara had been managing, and there had not been room for that kind of noticing. Wren received the observation with her face composed, and then she went and sat by the window and looked out at the snow for a while. On the third morning, the road was clear enough, and the shoe was replaced, and Cobb's survey was finished. He settled with Clara for the board and the barn use, paying what she asked without negotiating it, and he stood in the doorway with his coat on and his saddlebags over his shoulder. He said, "You run a good station." Clara said, "Thank you." He said, "I heard what Pruett told you. The driver mentioned it. I don't say that to be in your business. I say it because it's a wrong decision, and someone ought to tell you that someone else thinks so." Clara looked at him for a moment. She said, "That's kind." He nodded and went out to his horse and rode down the pass, and Clara went back inside and stood at the counter for a moment, and then started the midday work. Nothing was said about the conversation. She said nothing about it to Wren. She kept it the way you keep something you're not sure what to do with yet, setting it on a high shelf where it is not in the way, but you know it is there. The lamp burned in the window that night as it always did. December came and settled in for good. The pass traffic thinned, as it always did in the deep cold, to the mail riders and the occasional freight wagon driven by someone who had no choice. Clara kept the station. She kept the lamp. She kept the road log and the supply ledger and the horse rotation, and she sent her monthly report to the company in a hand that was precise and complete, and gave Harlan Pruett nothing to find fault with. She did not think about Cobb Aldrin, or she thought about him the way you think about weather that has passed, noting that it had been there, and that it had not been a bad thing. It was a Thursday morning in the second week of December when she heard a horse on the approach path and looked out to see a rider she did not recognize, leading a pack animal loaded with supply crates. The rider turned out to be a boy of about 16, working for the Aldrin Road Survey Company, and the crates turned out to contain lamp oil, 3 months' worth, and a sack of good coffee and a bolt of heavy cotton flannel, and a note written in a plain hand on survey paper that said, "The lamp on the pass is a public service, and the oil is a business expense. Aldrin Road Works." There was no other explanation. Clara read the note twice. She set it on the counter. She began unpacking the oil. Nothing was said about it. There was no one to say anything to, and even if there had been, she was not sure what she would have said. Wren looked at the flannel and looked at her mother. Clara said, "It's for curtains." Wren said, "We don't need curtains." Clara said, We'll need something for the cold coming through the north window. Wren considered this. All right, she said, and went back to her letters. January was the hardest month. It always was on the pass. The cold came down off the ridge and sat there, not moving, and the wind found every gap in the stonework and the mortar and the door frame, and the lamp burned through oil faster than it did in the shoulder months, because Clara kept it burning longer, the nights being what they were. She had enough oil now. That was one thing. The stage line sent a rider up in mid-January with a letter confirming the arrangement with Denton Farr. March 31st. The company thanked her for her service. Clara wrote back a letter that was courteous and complete, and said nothing that could be used against her. She sent the rider back down with it, and then she went out and checked the road, and came back in and started the bread. She was not without a plan. She had been thinking since November, in the spare moments the station allowed, which were not many, but were enough. She had written to her mother's cousin in Millhaven, who ran a boarding house, asking about work. She had written to the county land office about a parcel of lower ground that had been sitting unpatented for 3 years, wondering what it would cost to file on it. She had written to no one about Pruett's decision, because there was no one in a position to change it, and she was not in the habit of complaints that went nowhere. She had not written to Cobb Aldrin, because she had no address for him, and because it would not have been appropriate, and because she was not sure what she would have said. February brought a thaw that lasted 4 days, and then a cold snap that was worse than January had been, and it brought something else. Harlan Pruett, again, in his company buggy. Again, with his hat in his hands and his expression arranged. He sat at the station counter and told Clara that a situation had developed. He told her that Denton Farr had taken a position on the Bitter Creek line, after all, as the pay was better. He told her that the company was looking at other candidates. He told her that in the meantime her continued operation of the station was appreciated. Clara said, "I see." Pruett said the company was confident a suitable man would be found by spring. Clara said, "And if one isn't?" Pruett said the company was confident. Clara looked at him for a moment with an expression that gave him nothing. She said, "I'll keep the station until you tell me otherwise." Pruett said that was very reasonable of her. She walked him to his buggy. She stood in the road. She watched him go. Then she went inside and told Wren that supper would be a little late, and went out to the barn and stood in the cold for a few minutes with her hand on the near horse's neck, not thinking about anything in particular, just standing there until she was ready to go back in. The lamp burned that night. It burned every night. It was on a clear night in the last week of February that she saw a rider coming up the pass in the late afternoon light, moving at a pace that was purposeful but not urgent, a man who knew where he was going. She watched from the window for a moment before she recognized the horse. She started the coffee. Cobb Aldrin came in out of the cold with his hat in his hand and snow on his shoulders and the same plain face he had left with in November, and he sat down at the counter and accepted the coffee and said, "I heard Farr took the Bitter Creek post." Clara said, "Word travels." He said, "I have a proposal." She looked at him, looked. He said, "Not that kind. A business one. For now." He had been in correspondence, he told her, with the Territorial Road Office. The pass improvement project had been extended and refunded, more substantially this time, and the survey work needed a base of operations on the upper grade for the spring and summer season. He was proposing to contract the station as that base, which would mean a payment to the station operator for board and barn and storage. A payment that would be regular and documented, and sufficient to make Harlan Pruett's timeline irrelevant, because the territory's contract would supersede the stage line's employment arrangement. He laid a folded document on the counter. It was a draft contract on territorial letterhead, already signed by the road office. Clara looked at it. She read it through once, carefully, the way she read everything. She said, "This is a real document. He said, "It is." She said, "You arranged this." He said, "The road office arranged it. I suggested the location." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because the lamp was on when I needed it to be, and because Pruett is wrong about what this station needs." Clara looked at the document again. She looked at the lamp in the window. She said, "All right." He signed his side of the contract. She signed hers. She put the document in the ledger box where she kept the station's papers, and she refilled his coffee, and they sat at the counter while the last of the afternoon light went out of the window, and the lamp in the sill came into its own against the dark. Nothing was said about anything else. Not that evening. Wren came out of the back room, assessed the situation, and said, "You came back." Cobb said, "I did." Wren said, "Good," and climbed up onto the bench across from him with her letters book and began her evening work as though this were entirely ordinary, which in her estimation it was. The survey crew arrived in March, 4 men and a mule string, and they set up their work out of the station, with the orderly efficiency of people who had done this before. Cobb ran a quiet operation. The men were respectful of the station and of Clara and of Wren, who had opinions about where equipment could be stored and communicated them without apology. By the end of the first week, the arrangement had settled into a routine that felt, to everyone involved, as though it had been in place longer than it had. Cobb worked the road grade during the days and came back to the station in the evenings. He ate supper with Clara and Wren and the crew, and after supper the crew played cards at the far end of the room, and Cobb sat at the counter with his survey maps, and Clara kept the ledgers and the station log, and they worked in the same comfortable quiet they had found in November. He fixed the north window frame on a Saturday afternoon without mentioning it beforehand. He simply appeared with a plane and a chisel, and worked at it for 2 hours until the draft was gone, and then he put his tools away and washed up and said nothing about it at supper. Clara said nothing about it either. The flannel she had made into a curtain for the back room window, where it kept the cold off Wren's bed. This was not commented on by anyone. The survey crew's youngest member, a boy of about 20 named Pell, burned the beans one evening when he had been left to watch the pot, and Wren told him with great seriousness that burnt beans were not a matter to be taken lightly, and that if he was going to be trusted with the pot, he needed to commit to the responsibility. Pell apologized with equal seriousness. Cobb, at the counter with his maps, said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved once and returned to where it had been, and Clara at the ledger saw it and looked back down at her figures. April came and the snow began to pull back from the lower grade, though it held on the upper ridge for another 3 weeks. The pass traffic picked up with the warming, and the stage came through twice a day now instead of once. And Clara was busy in the way she preferred to be, which was fully. Harlan Pruett sent a letter in mid-April saying the company had identified a candidate for the station position and would be in touch regarding arrangements. Clara filed the letter in the ledger box and said nothing about it to anyone. She said nothing about it to Cobb, but he had seen the company rider and he was not a man who missed things. He said, one evening when the crew had gone to bed and the station was quiet, "Pruett's still moving on this." Clara said, "He is." Cobb said, "The territorial contract runs through October." Clara said, "I know what it says." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There are other arrangements that would make the contract permanent." Clara looked at him. He said, "I'm not saying it right. Let me try again." He set down his pencil. He turned on the bench so he was facing her directly, which was not something he did casually. He said, "I have been watching you run this station since November. I have watched you keep the road and keep the lamp and keep your daughter and keep the ledgers and keep your head when Pruett came up here and told you things that were not fair to tell you. I watched you move rock in the dark in a storm without complaining about it. I watched you read a contract I put in front of you and asked the right questions before you signed it, which most people don't do." He paused. "I am not a man who says things before I'm sure of them. I'm sure of this." Clara was looking at him with the careful stillness she brought to situations she was taking all the way through before she committed to a position. He said, "I'm asking you to stay, permanent, as my wife, if that's what you'd want. The station would be yours in law as well as in practice, and the survey work keeps me on this road for the foreseeable future, so I wouldn't be leaving you to run it alone. But I want to be plain with you that this is a question, not a plan. If the answer is no, the contract stands and nothing changes. If the answer is not yet, that stands too. I'm not in a hurry and I'm not going to make you feel like you are." He picked up his pencil and set it down again. He said, "That's all of it." The lamp burned in the window. Outside, the wind moved through the pines on the upper ridge, a sound like something breathing slowly. Clara sat with it. She sat with it long enough that another man might have filled the silence with something, a qualification, or a softening, or a joke. Cobb did not. He waited the way he had waited all winter, which was to say without visible impatience, as though he understood that some things could not be hurried, and that trying to hurry them was the surest way to break them. She thought about the oil that had arrived in December on a pack mule with a note on survey paper. She thought about the window frame that had been planed smooth on a Saturday afternoon, without comment. She thought about Wren saying, "You came back with the satisfaction of someone whose assessment had been confirmed." She thought about the lamp in the window, which she had kept burning because it was what the station was for, and she did not know how to do the thing halfway. She said, "Yes." She said it plainly, the way she said most things. Then she said, "That's what I want." Cobb looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face, not quickly, and he did not set it aside. He said, "All right." He reached into his coat pocket and set something on the counter between them. It was a ring, plain iron, worn smooth, not new. He said it had been his grandmother's and it was not fancy. And she said she could see that, and she held out her hand, and he put it on, and it fit well enough, which she took as a reasonable sign. They sat at the counter for a while longer in the quiet, the lamp doing its work in the window, and after a time Clara refilled the coffee, and they went back to their respective work, the maps and the ledger, which was not a romantic ending to the conversation, but was, for both of them, exactly right. Wren found out the next morning at breakfast, when Cobb was still at the station and sitting at the table in a way that was different from the way the crew sat there, a settled way. And Wren looked at her mother's hand and looked at Cobb and said, "Is that your grandmother's ring?" Cobb said, "It is." Wren said, "It's plain." He said, "It is." Wren considered this for a moment, and then she said, "All right," and ate her porridge. And that was the end of the discussion as far as she was concerned. The letter from Harlan Pruett arrived on a Wednesday in early May. It said the company's candidate had accepted a position elsewhere, and that the company remained grateful for Clara's continued service and would be in touch regarding future arrangements. Clara read it, filed it in the ledger box, and did not send a reply. She was not certain whether Pruett had learned about the territorial contract, or whether his candidate had simply found better work, or whether something else had happened entirely. She did not particularly need to know. The letter said what it said, which was that he was not coming up the pass in his buggy with his hat in his hands, and that was enough. The crew finished the survey work in August and moved on to the next section of the road project, a stretch of lower grade that would keep them within a day's ride of the pass for the rest of the season. Cobb came back to the station each evening. This was noted by the stage drivers, who noted most things, and by the mail riders, and eventually by the people in the valley who paid attention to such information, which was most of them. The woman who had made it her particular occupation to have an opinion about the station and its operator was a Mrs. Vane Elstrop, who lived in the valley and whose concern for the propriety of arrangements on the upper pass had been a regular feature of the general store's conversation since November. She had said at various points during the winter that it was irregular for a widow woman to be operating a relay station alone, that it was irregular for a survey crew to be boarding at a relay station, that the territorial contract was a convenience that smelled of something, and that whatever was happening up on that pass was not the kind of thing that reflected well on the valley. In May she had said all of this to Cobb Aldrin's face, in the general store in front of 7 other people, including the store's owner and 2 of the stage drivers. Cobb had been buying coffee and a new ledger book, which Clara had asked for. He listened to Mrs. Elstrup complete her remarks. Then he said, in the same plain voice he used for everything, that Clara Crale had kept the pass open all winter, with a lamp and a good head, and no help from anyone who had an opinion about it, and that the lamp she had kept burning in that window had saved his life in November, which was a fact he was not inclined to be quiet about, and that he intended to marry her, which the territorial contract would reflect as of the following month, and that he was grateful for Mrs. Elstrup's concern, and did not require any more of it. The store was quiet for a moment. One of the stage drivers said, "That's the woman who cleared the rock fall in December. I was on that run." The other driver said, "She did it herself before we got there." Mrs. Elstrup said something about how she was only thinking of what was proper. Cobb paid for his coffee and his ledger book and left. The store's conversation moved on to other things, as store conversations do, and what it moved on to was the rock fall and the storm in November, and the lamp that had been visible from the valley floor on clear nights. And by the time the afternoon was over, the story had been told in the way that stories get told in small places, which is thoroughly, and with the details that matter kept in and the details that don't left out. Mrs. Elstrup was quiet on the subject after that. It was as close to an apology as such a person gives, and Clara, when she heard about it from the mail rider who had been in the store, accepted it as such without comment. The wedding was in June, a plain ceremony at the station, with the survey crew as witnesses, and Wren standing beside her mother in her good dress, with her father's serious eyes and her mother's composure. The justice of the peace came up from the valley and said what was required. And Cobb said what was required. And Clara said what was required. And afterward there was a meal that Clara had cooked. And the crew ate it with the appreciation of men who had been eating camp food for 3 months. Wren said, at some point during the meal, "I want to be called Wren Aldrin." Cobb said, "That's a lot of the same sound." Wren said, "I know, I like it." He said, "All right." She said, "All right," and went back to her plate, satisfied. By the time the frost settled in for good that October, the station had a new porch step, the loose one that had been soft since spring, and the north window was tight against the wind, and the ledger box held a territorial contract and a marriage certificate and a letter from the county land office about the lower parcel that Clara had been watching for 2 years, which Cobb had filed on in August in both their names. The lamp burned in the window every night. It had always burned, and it continued to burn because that was what the station was for, and neither of them knew how to do the thing halfway. On a clear evening in November, the anniversary of the storm that had sent Cobb up the path toward the light, Clara stood in the doorway of the station and looked out at the pass road, which was empty and pale in the last of the day's light. The pines on the upper ridge were dark against a sky that was going from blue to the particular deep color it got just before the stars came out. Cobb came and stood behind her, and then beside her, and they stood there for a moment, looking at the same road. He said, "Cold coming." She said, "It always does." They went inside. Clara started supper. Cobb hung his coat on the peg by the door, the one that had been Aldis's peg and was now his. and he sat down at the counter with the survey maps for the spring project, which the territory had approved in September. Wren came in from the barn, where she had been checking on the horses, a task she had taken on herself in October, and performed with great seriousness. She stamped the snow from her boots and reported that the near horse was fine, and the far horse had been given extra feed because he looked like he was thinking about being cold, and she had decided to address it preemptively. Cobb said that was sound thinking. Wren said she knew it and went to wash her hands. The lamp in the window came into its own against the dark, steady and without drama, the way it always did, the way it had done all the long winter before, and would do all the long winter ahead, visible from the valley floor on clear evenings, as a fixed point of orange light at the top of the dark ridge. The station held its warmth, not waiting for anyone, not anymore. The recipe box that had sat on the high shelf since November of the previous year, the one that had been Clara's mother's, and that she had carried to the pass at 23 and had not opened since Aldous died because there had not been room for that kind of thing, sat on the counter now, open, the cards inside in use again, flour-dusted and handled, the way things get when they have been brought back into the life they were made for. And that was the story of Clara and Cobb Aldrin, a woman who kept a lamp burning through the hardest winter on the pass, and a man who found his way to it, and what they made of the light between them after that. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this one. Thank you.